Welcome to How to Write Good. I'm your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. Poppie is spelled Poppie. At my website, you can find my book, The Ninth Hour, or you can find my serialized novel, One Last Toast for Ebenezer Fleet. The Ninth Hour does cost money. The serialized novel is free on my website, and it is also free on this podcast feed as well as its own. So if you want to listen to that the serialized novel, you can always check out its own podcast feed. Our word of the week is chicanery, and chicanery means trickery used to achieve political, financial, or legal purposes. My L looks a lot like an R, so when I was reading over my definition of that word, I thought that it said regal purposes, which didn't make any sense. And I'm like, oh, that's an L, because I can't write. But chicanery, if you do want to spell this word, if you're looking at the video, it's up on the screen. Otherwise, it's spelled with a CH at the beginning of the word. So don't put SH. You're not going to be able to find it or figure out what it is. Chicanery, trickery used to achieve political, financial, or legal purpose. And I heard that used a couple weeks ago. It's kind of surprising. Most people don't use that word. This is a word I knew before, but I'm like, hey, I like how it sounds. It sounds like somebody rattling a rain stick to me, honestly. So we're going to jump into our accidental essence, and we are going to be talking about the margins this week. And I don't really know what I'm going to be calling this episode, but if I were to sum it up in a sentence or a couple sentences, we'll see how this comes out, I would say that I think that art should be on the margins of existence, okay? And the margins aren't necessarily a bad thing. I think that there's this common term, this word used in the U.S. I don't know if it's used other places, but there's this idea of marginalization, right? And if you don't know what the margins are, first of all, think about a book, and you have the centerpiece. The center part is where the central content is, and you have the center part with the central content, what you're reading, and the margins are on the outside of it. You might think, well, why do we actually use that word? I'm going to get to that in a second. But the margin means the edge in a way. Actually, it does mean the edge. What am I talking about? So when we talk about, in the sense we usually use it is when somebody is marginalized, they're pushed off to the side, and we don't pay attention to them at all. Like usually it's in a very negative connotation. The word the word margin and the word marginalization, though it's used almost exclusively in the U.S. and I don't know where else. I don't know if it's used in other English-speaking countries in the same way. But in the U.S., it's almost exclusively used to say, hey, we are going to disregard any issues this person has or this group has, etc. And I'm not going to get into that today. But I think that it has a history, not ironically, but oddly enough, it has a very interesting history. And I think that this idea of the margins, actually, if we think of life and we think of if we think of existence in a different way, it actually comes across in a way that isn't as negative. Now, there can be negative connotations depending on how you marginalize something or how you relegate it somewhere, especially people. But I think that we should look back at this idea of the margins, and we should look back at this idea of putting something in the margins because it belongs in the margins. I am not advocating putting people in the margins whatsoever, because I think that people are central to existence. But let me explain first. So there are certain things that are the most important things in life, and I've gone over this before to a certain degree, but you'd have things, generally you can sum it up in the word people, right? And you can sum those things up with other words as well. You can say, oh, my close associates, right? And then you go further to the center of your existence and you say, my friends. And then you say, oh, even closer, my family. And then you can go even closer and you get into this other circle. It's like my immediate family, my children. And then you can get, I would say, even closer and say, oh, my spouse, right? And you've gotten the person or the group of people you're talking about has gotten more and more narrow and more important to you subjectively, right? My wife is more important than if there are other people who are listening to this podcast. I'm sorry, if you're not my wife and you're not listening to this podcast, you aren't as important to me. than as my wife. And I think that's reasonable. I think most people would agree with that. Most people would be like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the idea of the margins is there are certain things that should not be the central focus of our life. And I think that it goes a little bit, I think there's more complexity to it. So I'm going to actually have to dive into what I'm talking about more today. Not just central to our life, but central to existence. You have certain things that are central to your life, right? Your children, your spouse, your close friends are going to be more central to your life than somebody you just met on the street and you have no idea who they are. It's going to be more important than somebody who's across the seas you've never met. It's going to be more important than politicians. It should be more important than politicians or celebrities or anything like that. But there's also things that I think if we look at our own personal lives, and we also look at society, we look at existence in general, and there are things that I think are more central in existence. Okay, they're closer. If we should focus on this over something else, we should focus on the thing that's more central to existence, right? As an example, if I have the choice between eating and spending some money and going to a movie, well, the pretty obvious choice is that I should eat. Survival is pretty at the core of who we are, right? If we can't survive, we can't do other things, and you need a certain amount of wealth, you need a certain amount of extra resources to actually create anything extra, okay? So if you see cultures that have produced a lot, it's likely that culture, if you see cultures that have produced a lot of art, right? They've built amazing things. It's likely that culture, on some level of society, has extra to go around, okay? And the cultures I think that have made the biggest leaps have had extra, more for everybody, right? It's not just for a select group, but the cultures that have made the biggest leaps in the most areas have had more for everybody. And if you look at this, it really makes a lot of sense because if you have an elite, and the elite gets really well fed, and the elite gets fat, and the elite has leisure time, because if you have enough food, you can have more leisure time, and if you have enough basic necessities, essentially. If the elite is the only one getting leisure time, the elite will think about stuff, and the elite will come up with ideas, and but it's all coming from one small group. So let's just say the elite is you have a country of 100,000 people, and the elite is 10,000 people, right? That is 1/10 of the whole population. Well, imagine if you suddenly had everybody well fed, and everybody had leisure time, and everybody could pursue different things. Now, some people would waste their time, some people would overeat, some people would get fat to the point where it's unhealthy, like I am, and different things like that. But there would be people from that regular population who would also be contributing to ideas. I guess that European countries have more of a class system than the United States, and there are certainly classes in the United States, but it's not rigid, right? I think that the people who think the classes are the most rigid, and maybe this is shifting a little bit, are the people probably toward the top who have been really rich or really connected for a very long time. But you can change classes if you do certain things in the United States, right? If you go to an Ivy League school, you're essentially allowed in to the upper class. And at the same time, money means more in a lot of cases than the classes in the United States. So if you make a lot of money because you invent something, right? I just heard of a guy a few months back who invented the wristbands for hospitals, and he made tons of money. And because he invented that, because he had that idea, he got really, really rich off of it. All these hospitals use this specific wristband. It's really weird. The guy who invented the paperclip, I think it's the same idea. The guy who invented a Leatherman, Jeff Bezos, I think he was middle class when he started out. Whatever you think about him, I think he was middle class. So there's the ability to move around, and there's people who come from lower classes who create amazing things, right? They can create something practical. They can go into something like a sport. They can go into the arts and create something beautiful that hasn't been done in the arts before. So if you allow everybody in the society enough to eat, or enough that they have leisure time to do stuff, right? And we have so much leisure time, and we definitely use our leisure time. We have so much leisure time these days, but at the same time, you might have some people who are creating things that aren't as good. You might have some people who, write books and they aren't as good, but you have more people doing it. So the chance that you're going to have somebody write really good books or make inventions that just change how things work is going to be bigger. Um, so we can't do that without the central idea of survival, and this is what I'm getting back to. So survival is at the center, okay? And I would actually, and some people would say, oh, survival is really, really at the center. But I would say that the people around you are more central to than survival, because people will actually give up their lives for other people, right? But I think people, survival, you have other things like that that are central. It's kind of like building a bridge. You need to build a bridge with structural integrity before you start to make it beautiful, or you need to build it in a way that it has structural integrity while at the same time being beautiful. I can build a bridge that is ugly that works, and I can build a bridge that is beautiful that works, but I can't, and both of those will function, but I can't build a bridge that is beautiful that doesn't work, and it won't function if it doesn't work. That's kind of redundant to say, but that's what I'm talking about. So it's not that these things are unimportant, but it is that they are less central to reality, right? And you can look at this in a cosmic sense too, and we're going to get into that in a second, because I think it's good for understanding. But if you just think of it even in terms of your own life, and you think of it in terms of, oh, what people should focus on, I think that you can still get to that end result of understanding, oh, what's going on here. It's not to say these things in the margins are worse. It's just they're not as central than these things that aren't. And I have a very good reason for saying that art and writing, any creative activity should be in the margins, and it is necessarily in the margins. That's the point. I'm not just saying these things should be in the margins. I'm saying they are necessarily in the margins. So I back in college, I took a medieval history class, and we learned about illuminated manuscripts in the medieval history class. Now, if you look back before the printing press existed, you had a lot of monks. That's who did it. Before the printing press existed, the manuscripts were written by hand. Scrolls were written by hand, and then codexes were written by hand. And all a codex means, if I'm getting this correct, a codex is the form of book we have. I don't have a book around me right now, but it's a book. It's square. You know, it has binding on the one side, and then you have pages that you turn. And I believe the technical term for that is codex. I should have it as a word of the week, just so I can make sure I'm correct. So these monks were taking codexes, and they were often taking skins, right? If they didn't have access to paper, and they were writing, oftentimes it was religious text, the Bible, on skins of paper, codexes that were made out of skins. So when these monks were doing this, what they would also do is they're like, well, we wrote the text right here, and then in the margins they would create art, right? They'd have all this art in the margins, and oftentimes in the margins, they would put really bizarre things. They would put demons. They would put animals that don't make sense. Like you have a dog with a duck's head or something like that. I don't know if that's a specific one, but things to that extent. Just weird, bizarre creatures that don't actually exist in our reality and are things turned on their head. And there's actually a really good reason for this. And I didn't know this before this year, but it's really interesting. So there's a YouTuber I'll point you to if you want more information on this. He is a Orthodox Christian, actually, and he talks about symbolism, and he talks about this idea as well. His name's Jonathan Pageau, but it's spelled like the French, Pageau, right? But you say it Pageau. I believe you say it Pageau. Jonathan Pageau, and he talks about this idea. So I'm kind of pulling this from his ideas and then bringing it into my own. So I already knew about illuminated manuscripts. I knew what they were, and when he was talking about it, it's like, yeah, I know exactly what that is. And you have all this stuff in the margins of those manuscripts. So what the what do you call it? What older Christians, like a 500s, even before that, thought is that reality was concentric circles, right? You can think of reality as concentric circles, not a physical reality that we understand it to be, but more of a symbolic reality, okay? A reality that goes beyond what we understand physically and actually is more real than our physical reality. But that gets into something completely different. And if you're a materialist and you think this is all there is, you're going to be like, well, that's a bunch of bogus. But this is how they understood things. They said, okay, it's kind of like concentric circles, and God is at the center of everything, right? And then you go a little bit farther out, and man is a little farther out, and then you go a little farther out, and you have animals and different types of animals, right? Probably in the sense of the medieval Christians and pre-medieval Christians, there was this idea of there's clean animals, like that's clean as understood from the Bible, like the Torah and the first 5 books of Moses, and then there were probably unclean animals as well. So you keep on going farther and farther out in these circles, and you get farther and farther away from God. And then when you get to the outer edge, you get things like demons, but you also get chaos, right? So reality is essentially like God is order. And the farther you get away from order, the further you get away from order, the more chaos you get. So you get things that have been turned on their heads. You get things that are bizarre, you get things that are disorder, you get things that are dark, you get things that are evil, right? Now, here's where the idea of the margins comes in. And this is actually a term that I think is really useful. It's a term that I've just been chewing on it for a while in this idea. Now, when you write a piece of text, or when you were a monk and you were writing the Bible and you were putting all these things in the margins, what those things in the margins were called marginalia, right? We still have that term. We don't use it as much in our speaking, but the idea is that it's marginalia. And if you think of it in terms of the text, that makes a lot of sense. But if you think of it in terms of this symbolic or metaphysical understanding of reality of concentric circles, the stuff on the outside you could consider marginalia, I believe. And you have this, you have marginalia in this. Marginalia in this. Forgetting the word off the top of my head. You have marginalia in this metaphysical understanding of reality. You have marginalia in how we understand life, right? So sweets. Sweet food is in the margins, right? It is not something you need. It is something you can have. And there's also the margins. There's the marginalia in your own life. Certain things are much more important to you subjectively. So I think we can understand this on multiple different levels. So I think that even if you don't believe there's any reality beyond the physical, I think you can still understand this. I think the fact that we speak. Okay, so this is a side note. I think that we see evidence of metaphysical things on a day-to-day basis. Okay, we are talking and we are taking in ideas and we're taking in reality and we're representing it in our mind. Okay, now the extent to which the metaphysical exists, I think, is difficult to determine. But the fact that the metaphysical exists, I think it's hard to rebut. We're taking things into our mind and we're representing those things. The things that the ideas in our minds are not physical things, right? The experience within our minds are not physical things. I would even argue that the experiences we have within the world is not the experiences are not physical things. The experiences we take in the world, we take in those things that are happening to us, and then our mind puts a framework around that, right? So I think that to say, oh, there's nothing but the physical is I don't think it makes any sense, because I think we experience the metaphysical every single day. And now, does that metaphysical include a God? That's I think a different argument, but it's kind of like saying, oh, I don't believe in God, and then people start talking about Christianity, or they start talking about Islam, or they start talking about Judaism, right? There's a difference between saying I don't believe in Judaism than I don't believe in God. And people always get that messed up. There's really big thinkers in our culture who do this too, where they start saying, oh, I don't believe in God, and they immediately jump to the Christian God. Well, I think what you're doing is you're assuming, oh, there's no God. You're not actually arguing whether a God exists or not. You're not addressing that idea of you not believing in God. You're addressing whether or not the Christian God is the God that exists, okay? Because there could be a God, but it could be a God we haven't even imagined, right? There could be a God and we haven't even addressed. There could be a God and we haven't even imagined what that God is, or we haven't even been like, oh, this God could be this way. So I think that that's the same thing. I think that saying that there's no metaphysical things in reality, I think that, and then you talk about God, I think that you're not addressing things that we actually experience day to day. And some people say, oh, that's just an illusion. In a way that it's something beyond the physical. It's something we're experiencing that goes beyond the physical, right? I think that I have a friend who's I don't know, is he done with school? He might be considered a philosopher, but he's a philosophy student in a graduate program, and he teaches philosophy. So maybe I'm understanding metaphysical incorrectly, but I thought it was alongside the physical. And there are certainly things that we experience that are not physical themselves that are alongside the physical, and that's why I'm putting that in there. So that's just a side note. You can take it or leave it. So we call these things marginalia, these things on the outside, right? The demons, are marginalia, chaos, darkness, all these things that would be farther away from God. And if you think about it in like a Christian sense, how the Christians understood it or understand it today, I actually think the Christians have a less robust idea of reality today than they used to, honestly. If you think of it that way, God is light, right? There's this understanding that when you step into when you go to heaven, whatever that is, it doesn't have any sun or moon or stars because God lights that existence, right? So you have this idea of light, and then people who do not believe in God, right, who are not saved, are cast into the outer darkness. So you have light and darkness. So that's just an example right there of this playing out in the biblical narrative. This idea and how it works is actually, I think it is reflected in the world. And it's not necessarily reflected in the world saying that one or the other side of things is better than the other. It's more reflected in the world in a way that shows that these things exist in reality, and this all contributes to reality. I'm not trying to say, so there's a few things I'm going to bring up in a second that I'm not trying to say, oh, this is better than the other thing. I have my own opinions about a lot of stuff, but I'm not trying to say any of these are better than the other thing. I think they interact, and I think they actually serve an important purpose within each other. And I think that without them, you don't get the full extent of what reality is. And I think that you miss some things that you wouldn't have otherwise. So it's reflected in reality. So things that are in the center, right? You have order. You have the man, right? The boss, consistency, schedules, conservatives, history, etc. And then we have things that I would say that are more in the margins, right? Disorder, the rebel, variability, spontaneity, the future, the left side of the aisle in terms of politics. And none of these things are evil in themselves. I think that all these things can be twisted, and we have books that show these things being twisted. We actually have two dystopian novels that showed the different ends of the spectrum in terms of this, to a certain degree, but I think that it does. The interesting part is that if you take any of these ideas and you take them too far, according to these two books, you end up with slavery no matter what. So one book is 1984 by George Orwell. It's essentially like top-down rule. Everything is controlled. You have complete order, and everything is controlled by the central government that has a face, but it doesn't really have a face. The face is just a mask, honestly, for inhumanity. And everyone is a slave within that society because of this order that it keeps on. It's order to the extreme. It's order to the point where there are essentially thought police that are trying to control what people think, what people say, and you have to be afraid of even your own neighbor because people are going to impose that order in on you who might not know you or who do know you, or who might love you or who might hate you. And then there's disorder, and this is reflected in what would you call it? A Brave New World, where everybody is doped up. They've kind of gone to the edge they've gone as far as they could because they're libertines. Everybody exists for the drug that they take, and nobody cares. They can do whatever they want. There is no structure. Well, there is structure, but there is no structure in terms of what they're doing. I don't know. That's a little bit different. So the other side of the spectrum is a Brave New World, where it's more libertine and they've gone too far in the opposite direction and everybody's on drugs. That's how they exist, and it doesn't matter really what you do, but it all leads back to slavery, right? It's really interesting. I mean, you have too much you have freedom to such a great extent, and you engage in that freedom individually, and it leads you back to a rigid sense of everything. It leads you back to that rigidity, and then you also have the order, and that leads you back to this rigidity, and that's all slavery. So I'm not trying to say, you have the center idea, and then you have the margins, and I'm not trying to say one is better than the other. I actually think that there needs to be an interplay between both to actually get anywhere. For example, we have this idea of the history and the future. Okay, this is just to show you that it's not one or the other. I think history is really important. I also think planning for the future is really important. Now those things would fall more into the order side of things. But at the same time, we don't know what the future is, and you need to react to the future in a way that is appropriate to the future. Okay, so you can plan and plan and plan, but if you're only going according to your plans and not doing anything creative to react to that future, it's probably the case that you're not going to do as well, because of the fact that you're not able to shift and change and react to that future in a way that is flexible, right? Order isn't flexible, but spontaneity is flexible. So if somebody goes into the future and you have this big, you're just smacked upside the face, and you don't have any ability to be spontaneous, maybe that's not the right word, maybe you have no ability to be flexible, you're going to be hit a lot harder than somebody is. So it's not a if or the other, right? We exist within the present, we look back to the past to understand the world and humanity generally, and then we look to the future. So we're within our own selves, we're kind of existing in this interplay between these different things. You can think of it kind of as Freud's id, ego, and superego, with the superego being the past, the id being the future, and the ego being the present, your present self and what you know. So with art or literature, whatever creative thing we're making, where does that belong? What sphere does art spring from? And if you listen to my discussions on art before, you may know the direction I'm going. This idea of margins makes a lot of sense to me, because it can be difficult to find your place, or at least for me, it makes a lot of sense because I try to do a lot of creative things. I'm in that sphere, I'm in that world, but at the same time, you feel that it's difficult to be like, okay, where do I exactly fit, right? And if you are in the margins, it's going to be harder to fit into something central. I think that people who are more in the margins and who are really creative are going to have a harder time fitting into a more rigid structure. I have a friend, he was actually on the podcast a ways back. His name's Dan too, and he is a cowboy. I'll call him that because that's the easiest thing, but he also makes music, and he didn't really fit into that structure. And I bet you he would agree with me, this idea that it is difficult to find out where you fit and find out where you belong, and you do need to do some searching. And what he did, I don't know if he said it on the podcast, but he essentially quit his job and just drove out west. And that is the epitome of going out to the margins. It's actually almost literally the margins in the history of the United States, if you're not from the United States. So, we have the frontiers. We had the frontiers that were way out west, and what people did is they grabbed their family, they got a wagon, and they packed all their stuff in, and they went out west to the frontier. They went out west to the margins of everything, right? There were people out there, of course, but there weren't any big cities. There weren't any big civilizations. It was a lot of rough and tumble country, and these people ended up being rough and tumble if they were going to make it. But I think that's, in a way, that's what he did. He went out west. He decided to do something that most people don't do. I don't know if he still does it, but for a time he was working on a ranch, riding horses, working with cattle, and also doing rodeo stuff, which I think is really cool, which most people don't do. But I think that there's the sense that you do need to break out of that structure, and especially for certain personality types, they do need to break out of that structure, get away from what is normal. I think this is why there's this idea of finding yourself. I don't know. I don't think you necessarily find yourself. Maybe you do. Haven't found that to be true at all. But people have this idea of finding themselves, and I think this is where it springs from. It springs from this idea that they feel confined. There's been other instances of this too. There's actually a game that does this as well, and you see this. You see it reflected in so many different things. I can't remember what it was called. You know, the book about the kid, and it's a true story. He ended up dying. Don't do this if you're young, because it's dangerous, and you probably need somebody who knows what they're doing. We don't want you to die. Let's just say that. He went up to Alaska, and he went out to a place that was really rough. Alaska is frontier country in a lot of ways, because barely anybody lives up there in a lot of places. It's way up at the North Pole, essentially. He went out to the frontier, and he lived in a bus, and he couldn't get back. I think that there was a river that was going to be overflowing or something like that, because of spring, or I don't know what time of year it was. He ended up dying. But that's what he was doing. A lot of people do this. There's a game that's called Stardew Valley. I actually played it. I think it's really well put together. But the guy who created it, at the beginning of the game, what happens is you have a guy who's in an office job, and he's in this soul-sucking corporation, right? The soul-sucking corporation is the man. It is order. It is structure. It's like, oh, this has been built up. This is huge. It's imposing its will on you from above, right? And what he does is he quits his job. He moves out to a farm, and he starts new. He starts at the frontier, essentially. He's starting at zero, all right? So I think for a lot of creative people, and I think for a lot of people in general who maybe wouldn't consider themselves creative, they find themselves in the margins in some way. It might be the case that you have some issue, right? You might have some family issue, and that pushes you to the margins. I found that pain pushes you to the margins in a lot of ways. You might have a mental illness of some sort, or if you want to call it a mental illness, that pushes you to the margins. You might have a physical ailment that pushes you to the margins that people just can't understand. It's not their fault; they just can't understand it. And I think they should be gracious as possible toward you, and you should be gracious toward them as well. I think that's how it should go. If you do feel like you are in the now you probably are, because and being in the margins isn't necessarily bad. It's not necessarily fun, but it's not necessarily bad. Okay. Now the question is, and you probably already know the answer: is art or anything creative in the margins, right? And I would answer yes, because someone who is trying to create good art isn't trying to just take what has been done before. If you push art as far to the center as possible, what actually is, if art exists, right? Because maybe it's not art, maybe art doesn't exist. But if art exists and we push it as close to that, though, as far into those concentric circles as possible, and it is good art, we're going to get something that it takes old ideas and recreates them and puts them together in a new way. And it reveals something that wasn't done before, right? But if you're an artist, if you're doing something new, you're pushing out, you're like an explorer going into undiscovered territory. Gosh, I can't talk. And it seems to be the case that really good art is in the margins. Okay. Some people, so this seems to go against what I talked about in the past with the idea of craft, but we're going to get to that in a second. I think that the best art is out in the margins. I think the best art is out. The person doing the best art is out exploring. It might be the fact that Van Gogh was such a good artist because he had to deal with so much crap. It might be the fact that Nietzsche had such unique ideas. Maybe he didn't. Maybe I'm misreading that. It might be the fact that Nietzsche had such an impact on our reality, on Western society, because of the fact that he was in the margins. He had constant health issues, which I believe pushed him out to the margins. It might be the fact that Isaac Newton did such great he discovered so many great things in science. He created calculus because he was in the margins. I don't think he was Marian, and I believe that according to when we look back at him, it could have been very much the case that he had autism in some sense. Bill Gates, it could be the fact that he created Microsoft because he was in the margins. Now it has led him back to the center. He is very, very, he is the man nowadays, but it has led him back to the center. But it could have been the case that that's what helped him become so big. Actually, if you look at it, he was dealing with something that was new, right? He was dealing with something that nobody else dealt with. When he was a kid, I believe either his parents or somebody he knew had access to computers so he could code, right? So he was dealing with cutting edge technology. Cutting edge technology is on the margins, in the margins. You don't really see it in regular society. And then nowadays, computers are at the center of our how we work and at the center of society, but back then they weren't. So he was working with something at the margins, which helped lead him where he is to be at the center, and he was able to guide that in a way. You also have people who are really intelligent. People who are really intelligent are at the margins in some sense. If you're really ridiculously intelligent, you are in the margins. You might be thrust into the center, but at the same time, you might not be able to connect to other people as well, just because you're so intelligent. So I think this is why stories that have an agenda don't usually work out well, if we want to bring it back to literature and writing. Stories with an agenda are trying to be the man and do something different. They're trying to be both in the center and in the margins at the same time, to the same extent. Okay, so what they get is they have the person who is, you can think of it as like overly indulging in structure in stories, right? If you have no variation whatsoever on anything, your story is probably going to be coming off as not interesting. This is a lot of people's gripe with movies nowadays. It seems to be the case that there's a lot of movies by committee where you have people sitting around the room who are like, well, we have this structure for this type of movie. What we're going to do is we're going to write a movie like this, and people throw out ideas and they're like, okay, this fits in here, this fits in there. And there's no exploration that has gone on to create this story, to create this movie. One of the reasons I believe why some movies in the past have stood out to us so much. One of the reasons why certain movies have stood out to me is because something different was being done. And if you're someone who is worried and you're like, well, I want to try something out, you could try it out. It's okay if you crash and burn. And I always go back to that. It might not end up being good. You just have to be aware of that. But it's okay to try something out. But there's movies in the past. There's movies that I've seen that I'm like, I don't know how much I like the movie, but I like what's going on and the things that are trying out. They're doing something different. They're not just sticking to what everybody else has done. This is probably why people like Quentin Tarantino, or why he's so big, because he just tries stuff. He does stuff different. And I don't know, I haven't seen all of his movies, but they are certainly something out of the norm in terms of movie making. He tries to explore those fringes, and he does explore those fringes. But because art exists in the margins, okay, so art exists in the margins, but art needs to be tied to order. And I think people understand things emotionally, and I think people attach on to certain ideas, and then they emotionally understand those things. They go through some weird emotional logic, and they come to some logical conclusion based on those premises. And I think a lot of people have thought, oh yeah, they understand on an emotional level that art is in the margins and they're in the margins. And they think, oh, as long as we keep on pushing out. But if you keep on pushing out away from the center, eventually you get chaos, which I think is what's happened in the traditional art world to a great degree. You have art that it's nothing. It's not representing anything. It's said to represent something, but it really isn't. It doesn't. If you detach it from the commentary that the artist talks about, it doesn't actually present anything. It doesn't actually express anything to the person. The words the person says, right? The words the artist says do mean something, but the art itself doesn't express anything, right? Nowadays, you could take a computer, you could smash it to pieces, and if you're someone in the art world, you can say it's a piece of art, and then somebody will buy it for $2 million. Now, there might be other stuff going on there that allows this to happen, but the art world, it seems like they've gone out in this direction. They've gone so far out in the margins. They've just allowed themselves to leap off that edge that they've just plunged into chaos. 6 months ago, you had that banana that was duct taped to the wall, which, there was this big artist duct taped the banana to the wall and said it was art, and it sold for I thought it sold for several $100,000. Maybe it was like tens of thousands of dollars, but I can't remember because I don't care that much. Well, I do care about it because it's art, and I think art should be it. I don't think that's art, but I don't care about the banana. Somebody just has that banana. I actually think that the person eating it did better art, was that had more value to it than the banana duct taped to the wall itself. But people have jumped off the edges, and they haven't realized that art has to be tied back to order to actually work. Okay, this is where the interplay comes in. You're not just in order, and you can see it in how humans work too. We have a structure, right? How the human body is, it's 2 arms, 2 legs. You know, it might depend. You might lose an arm, you might lose a leg, you might lose an eye. But we're very symmetrical. We have our 2 eyes, we have a mouth, we have a nose, right? We are encased in this physical body. Not encased, but we are this physical body, right? And we have structure, and our world has structure, and our thinking has structure too. I would call that structure logic. Whether it's used well or not, it depends on the person, but I would call that structure logic. So this all has structure. But at the same time, we exist in a world that is constantly in flux as well. We exist in it. You have people being born, you have people dying is one representation. I am constantly changing. You're constantly changing. You're constantly getting older. 10 years ago, I was... You don't get to... I was 19 10 years ago. Wait, I don't know. I don't even know how old I am. Something like that. I was in my teens 10 years ago or something like that. I was just starting college, essentially. 10 years before that, I was a kid. And so I've been constantly changing every single day. I change and different things happen in my life, right? It doesn't always stay the same. It is static in a lot of ways. It feels static in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of change happening as well. Okay, so art has to be tied back to order. If you go back to my idea of craft, if you go back to my podcast, I think there were 2 or 3 of them on craft. I talk about this a lot, so you can actually jump into this a little further in relation to writing itself and why craft is so important. And I actually just talked about the devolution of art. But if you disregard it, if you disregard art, you're going to keep on taking art to its logic. If you not disregard art, if you disregard order, you're going to take art to its logical conclusion. It's an interplay, and that's the whole point of this. Art lives in the margins. I think it's important. And if you're someone who's really creative and you're like, man, it's really hard to get going, I don't really know what to do, especially if you're a writer. Because writers, I think, exist within... I think this is more evident in writing than other forms of art. Because writing exists within the language, right? Writing can't happen without the structure of the language. The language itself, because it's like more of an organic thing, it does this not flawless. I guess it does it without even thinking because everybody contributes to it. But writers have to contend with this structure of language that is unlikely to change much in their lifetime. And they have to contend with this... the generativity of language, if that's the correct term. They have to contend with this idea that language can be used in so many amazing ways, and they have to marry these two, and they have to make something out of it. They also have to look for ideas that are in the margins, and then these ideas connect back to what actually is the case. They have to do this, and I think it becomes very hard. And I think that this is very evident, this idea of writing and the creative writing is in the margins, but at the same time, it has at least a thread flowing back to that center. You can think of it kind of like a creature. You can think of it as maybe an octopus, right? At the center is the heart, and you have these arms that flow out from it. Or you can think of it as a root system. You know, you have the center, you have the trunk, and then all these things flow out from that, or branches, I guess. And I think that's what's happening. I think that you do have to exist in both worlds, and I think to fling yourself into either world is going to end you in an area that is either you're going to have something uninspiring that is according to, it's by rote essentially, or you're going to have something that is not recognizable as order at all, or very unrecognizable as order.